Welcome to the Health Systems CIO show. I'm your host, founder, and editor Anthony Guerra. On today's episode, I'll be speaking with Dr. Susan Harkness Regli, Associate CHIO for Human Computer Interaction at the University of Pennsylvania Health System. Dr. Regli is also a senior fellow with the Penn Institute for Biomedical Informatics and adjunct assistant professor of informatics with the Perelman School of Medicine. Dr. Regli, thanks for joining me today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Oh, very good. Why don't we start off? You want to tell us a little bit about your organization and your quite unique and I believe new role?
Yes, that'd be my pleasure. I am employed at the University of Pennsylvania Health System, which has, I think at this point, 7 hospitals, and tons of outpatient practices. And we have a, complex organization with lots of different types of technology needs. The role I came into Penn Medicine as a human factor scientist, and in that role, I worked primarily with patient safety and also with clinical informatics to optimize workflows for safety and for efficiency and effectiveness. And recently, we have created a new role that specifically focuses on human-computer interaction, which I think is a very interesting and valuable thing for Penn to have done as health systems become more and more like a software development company almost, where we're taking vendor software, we do some of our own software builds, and combining them not just technically, but from the standpoint of the user. And so the human-computer interaction field came about specifically to try to make things more usable for people in their homes, computers more usable in their homes and workplaces. Human factors came about when we were building big systems like airplanes that had a human as part of the design. And if there were problems with the human, you could literally destroy everything. And so those two fields are really trying to look at the role of a human in the system and all of the things that can affect that person in trying to achieve their goals. And I think that the advent of AI in particular has made it obvious that that interaction or that relationship between the human being and the health information technology or any information technology is really key to what we are doing.
Very interesting. So when I think of human factors, you mentioned airplanes and things like that. There's sort of two different levels I think of it at. One is where the actual physical structure of the human has to somehow meld with the structure of the
Right,
machine,
right.
but not so much in the other bucket I'm thinking of, which is more of a human-computer interaction, where again it's almost not like this exoskeleton that needs to function around the physical human. It's a different type of interaction. So you're really dealing with a keyboard, screen size, things like that.
Yes.
So is that right? Kind of two buckets kind of thing there?
Yeah, I would say the first bucket we typically would call ergonomics, physical ergonomics, and that is, your description is good. Is the person tall enough to reach the buttons that need to be pushed? Are they going to visually see indicators of a problem? And then we talk about cognitive ergonomics, and cognitive ergonomics is really looking at decision making and information processing and
Mm.
how is the person using the information that they're getting from the system. And so HCI, which I'll use as a short name for human computer interaction, HCI really comes in that cognitive ergonomics field and pushes into really understanding what is the workflow that the human being or the user of the technology is doing, and what are the capabilities of the technology that can help that person think about things better, make better decisions, find what they need, all of those kinds of things. So it's ergonomics in the brain.
It's fascinating. It really is fascinating. And I'm just thinking that, uh, you need to, I'm sure part of your work is just extremely closely evaluating that human computer interaction and finding those red flags. Like, oh,
Yes,
this button, this thing they have to click on, it's in the wrong place or it's on the wrong screen, or this is the point in their interaction with this application where we're hitting, it's like a road bump every time. It's got to be moved, right? If friction, we
exactly.
use words like friction and things
Yep,
like that, cognitive load. And we all are living through this every day. And I think what we're trying to do personally is to, AI and some of the AI tools that are generally available, as you interact with them and are trying to get them to do things for you, you're figuring out how to do it with as little friction as possible or how to continually remove points of friction so it gets smoother and smoother and you have some control there. But a lot of times when you're just an employee anywhere and you're dealing with a vendor supplied or supplied from anywhere application, you don't feel like you're empowered to change those road bumps. You have to live with them, and that's why we get burnout, right? Because we're
exactly,
living with
exactly.
all these road bumps that we've been handed. And in the old days, people felt like they didn't have any say. IT decided what they were going to get, made the purchases. We've gotten a lot better, but this sounds like it's all part of a long evolution.
It is. It is. It's we use the phrase user-centered design, and the idea is that the person that's using the technology is trying to do something,
Yeah.
right? And when we look at an interface, any interface, we use heuristics for evaluation to say, is it using the user's language? These are Jacob Nielsen came up with 10 usability heuristics that are still often used. And does it make sense? Is the button always in the place that I expect it to be? And am I always banging my head trying to find the information that I'm looking for? And you can either say, well, tough, you just have to work around the problems, or you can say, you know what, we can build it better. And I think the push or the advantage that HCI gives is not just we can build it better, but we can look at the overall process
Hmm.
that the person is using with that, what are they doing with technology? What are they doing without technology? And try to understand where the improvements should come in. What should be standardized. You use the word friction, which made me think that one interesting thing is that in healthcare, sometimes we try to create friction to stop somebody from being able to do something that they shouldn't be able to do. So, clinical decision support, I work a lot with people doing clinical decision support. And the question there is often, how do you direct somebody down the right path? How do you make it easy to do the right thing without putting stops in place that will keep them from being able to do their job?
Hmm.
So hard stops, we try to avoid hard stops anywhere we can, but we also want to make sure that it's very, very difficult to do the wrong thing. So it's
Right.
really a balance between those things.
Yeah, that comes up a lot in cybersecurity. That introduction of friction in order to increase security while not becoming an impediment. So it's sort of a minimum necessary amount of friction.
Right,
Um,
right.
yeah, and we see that a lot of clinical decision support. You've got alert fatigue. It's coming up a lot in AI too around review of notes. So you're having ambient create the note for you, and it seems like in that area we want to balance between um, if you see that nobody's making any changes to the notes that are being put out, you say, well, they're not even looking. But if you were to see massive changes to every note, you'd probably have clinicians saying this is terrible. This doesn't
Right.
say
They're not
anything
going to
to.
use it.
So you live with
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
Goldilocks zone.
And that's exactly what the approach that we are taking an approach to evaluation of this technology that is looking specifically at AI based, generally AI based technology that is rolling it out in as careful a manner as we can, but also trying to keep up with the number of different tools that are coming out. That people want to use. People are some people are very interested in using these new tools. And we start with an alpha group, which is just people who are like clinical champions or informatics champions. providers or nurses who try the technology in their practice, just to decide should we even go through, should we even go forward with doing beta testing of it. We're using surveys in between each stage. I generally don't like surveys, but it's a good way to get sort of standard information about each of the different tools. And then before we go to what we call a beta phase, we make sure that it seems, no safety red flags, and that people think that it might fit into a good workflow. Then we go to a small group of maybe 25 to 50 people per role and try it out with them. And again, collecting data, collecting usage data. We had an experience specifically with technology that was drafting replies to patient messages. And we had exactly that kind of event happen where we looked and said, there's a particular role that is not doing any editing. And we went and we talked to them, and we found out that, you know, it's being produced, it's coming from the system that they're used to using. Usually when we put a technology into the system, we're putting it in there because it's right, or we think
Hmm.
it's right. If it doesn't work, it's an anomaly. And in this case, we're putting it in there and we're assuming that there are times when it's not going to be right.
Right.
And so it's really reteaching that attitude towards the technology, but by monitoring it and by going, small scale before going to big scale, we were able to catch that and did some changes in both permissions and education and the design of the interface to try to mitigate that issue of somebody just looking at it and saying, "Well, the system produced it, so I'm going to send it as is."
Right. Right. Yeah, it seems like we're in a very interesting phase right now in healthcare. I think of 2010, the meaningful use phase. A lot of people are sort of looking back at that as not a missed opportunity, but an event that brought a lot of digitization, but a lot of cost uh,
Mhm.
in terms of usability, physician well-being, clinician well-being. Um, a lot of downside, a lot of upside, but a lot of downside. And it feels like this is a different type of tsunami, right? That was a tsunami, a government-inspired tsunami with the incentives. This is a tsunami, almost a user-directed tsunami. As you
Mhm.
said, the desire for these tools is overwhelming. They're flowing into healthcare both through sanctioned front doors where they're going through governance and through unsanctioned where they're just being used, and people just want to use the tools they want to use. And it seems like one of the efforts is we're trying to not repeat the mistakes of the past. So we're trying to make sure everything that's going in is vetted and everything's going a little smoother and a little better so we have sort of less cleanup on the back end. Does that sound right at all?
Absolutely. And that's exactly um, what Penn Medicine is trying to do, and I know a lot of other health systems are trying to do, is do it right this time. I will
Yeah.
say I've been giving talks on electronic health records and usability for years, and I've been saying, the paradigm has to shift because right now we have this amazing tool that gives us all kinds of discrete data, and we love what we can do with the discrete data. Even before we were talking about large language models and such, even just basic machine learning or algorithms, we love what we can do with this data, but we're still making people touch the keys every time to put that data in, or a large amount of the data. And we're also making people go in and figure out what's in the chart, where there's just reams and reams of data about a patient that's been, under healthcare for many years, and we're expecting them to make sense of it, quickly in the moment when they need to make decisions. And I've been saying we need a paradigm shift to allow us to have the benefit of ththese electronic health records, which are awesome. They've really changed the way that healthcare is done, but not lead to the burnout that it definitely does lead to. And I think that I call myself an optimistic skeptic about large language models and this type of artificial intelligence, because it really is the first time that we've been able to say, okay, we have a tool that can somewhat reliably look at the chart and give you a summary of, thousands of data points
Yes.
without you having to find it all. Or we have something that can go through notes and create discretized data that can then be used for all of the amazing diagnostic work we want to do. And so finally, we have a possibility for this. As you said, the way that we roll it out is going to make a big difference in whether it's um, a long-term disaster or a long-term benefit. And I gave a talk recently at the American Medical Informatics Association. There's a researcher, Jacob Nielsen, who shook up the HCI community in 1989 by saying we should do discount usability, right? People were running these huge studies in companies. It was tons of money, and you'd get some information from it. But he stood up and said, we can do heuristic evaluation. We can do small think aloud studies with a small number of users. We can do more economical and less resource intensive work to evaluate this. And I'm actually working on I've proposed some heuristics and some other tools for doing discount evaluation of AI tools, which are slightly different. AI-based tools are slightly different, but I think we need a way to do something while these tools are rolling out very quickly. Um, and we need to make it as safe as possible. But if we stop every time a new tool comes out and do a major evaluation of it, we're not going to keep up. So it's the ER doc versus the surgeon, right? The ER
Yeah.
doc's got to put duct tape and bubble gum on it and make
Yeah.
sure that the patient stays alive, and then the surgeon, has to clean up the mess, as was said on a TV show, popular TV show that I recently watched.
Yeah, and you can't stop it, right? It's coming in. They're
It's
going to
coming.
use it. It's a
Yep.
question of, is it going to be sanctioned? Is it going to be controlled, or is it going to be the Wild West? And if you're running studies that take 6 months, forget about it. I mean, I'll
Right.
give you an example. A large conference that I won't name was held earlier this year, and 3 months later, they were putting out content from the conference, and that's ancient history in this world. And
Yeah.
I mean, it's almost unfathomable. And so the cycles of information, what's pertinent information, it's a question of from when the information was conceived and put together and when it got into my hands. And in the old days, a week, 2 weeks, a month might have been okay, monthly magazines, things like that.
Right. Right.
Now, with the things we're talking about, it's probably like, is it from more than a week ago? That it's fairly irrelevant, depending on what you're talking about. So if
Yeah.
you're in that kind of a world where you're dealing with rapid cycles, and as you mentioned, you need a new approach to evaluation, correct?
Right. 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 Yeah,
Yes.
and that's something that we're, actively working on. And I think that having me in this new position is part of that, right?
Right.
The acknowledgement that the interaction with the users of the technology has to be constant, rapid, iterative. We have to have ways to get structured feedback and input, participatory design with users um, on a rapid basis, because that's the way that we're going to roll things out safely and effectively, and not confuse the end users. I think that one of the things we need to be careful of is the number of different tools and different ways to do things that we're putting in front of end users.
Yep.
I speak of it as, you've got the back end technical integration, and then you've got the conceptual integration, which means how do all the tools work together when I, as a user, just open up my computer screen and see what's there? I don't care who's creating it. I don't care who built it. I just see what the functionality is. And, if you're not paying attention to how, not just what an individual tool does, but how those tools interact for the user of the systems, you're just going to create more clutter, or more confusion, and that's exactly what we don't need.
Yeah, I think of, I don't know if this is comes into your work, but this concept of value streams. that I've
Hmm.
come across here and there, and I've learned a little bit about. It's very interesting. It's sort of really easy to understand to me when I think of the patient and like a patient journey. So
Hmm.
if you're a health system and you're trying to optimize the patient journey, you sort of get into their shoes and do a little scenario, run a few scenarios. And if you really, really do it well, you can find all these little points of friction or all these little silos where, and I always think of it like dominoes. When I was little, I used to set up all these dominoes and knock them over. And then,
Hmm.
it
Hmm.
would knock them all. Now, if you had too much space, the next one didn't get hit. So to me, that's bad workflow. It's where there's a gap and the next
Right.
thing that's supposed to happen doesn't get triggered. That's the easiest way I think of workflow. So, value streams is a way, or as you mentioned, um, an individual, a clinician working across multiple systems throughout their day. Like we need to get into that because that's at a high level, right? That's workflow
Yeah.
at a high level. And then you can go down to a more granular level and talk about individual tools or individual applications, data moving across application silos. I just did an interview yesterday with an individual who was in charge of moving his health system's entire sort of compute into AWS from
Hmm.
on-prem. And the overarching reason was it helps break down data silos and it helps foster the movement of data across applications, which he said is absolutely where you need to go in order for this AI world we're moving in to function
Yeah.
properly, because these algorithms need to operate across a picture of data. So I don't know, wherever you want to go with that.
Well, and I would say that people also need to operate across these reams of functionalities. And if you're not thinking about what that experience is, so I do a think aloud protocol exercise in my class, and that's basically, two people sitting with one another, and one's trying to use a website in this instance to answer some questions, and the other one is watching them. Usually you would do this with, a design team watching. So I've put together this system and I want to see how a person uses it. You would be amazed at the surprise of one person versus the other person using the system. And, I'm sitting there as the watcher, for example, and I know that the button they're looking for is right up there and they're not seeing it. Or I'm sitting there as the person using it, and the way that I would do it is not the way that it's presented on the screen. I'm being a little bit vague, but you get the idea. That kind of testing, that kind of usability testing, that type of workflow testing is going to uncover, you know, we try to find the big problems fast, right? That is going to uncover some of the major things that, in a developer mindset or designer mindset might make complete sense to somebody. But when I, get to the web page or I open up my application, thinking as a surgeon or thinking as an
Right.
ICU nurse, I don't think about it the same way that that person who designed it thinks about it. And that's really at the crux of a lot of the work that I do. And a lot of the work that we do in the system to make sure that that user mentality is incorporated in the way that we do the way that we create systems and complex systems.
Right, right. Very good. Yeah, there's so much here. There's the idea that a lot of the tools that we use in healthcare are vendor delivered, almost all of them. That may
Hmm.
be changing a little bit, but talk to me about the dynamics of you've got different levels of this. You've got perhaps a new tool coming in, maybe from an existing vendor, maybe part of the package of offerings, a new tool being evaluated and coming in. Um, you may have some influence going forward as a user, as a customer, to influence the roadmap of how things get adjusted or changed. And now more and more we have building going on, as you mentioned, in organizations like yours. There's probably some pure build going on, but now I think there's going to be a lot going on in things like Epic Agent Factory, where you've got physician builders building things. Theoretically, I would think they would all be working with you, understanding human factors, so they're optimizing their build.
Hmm.
So talk to me about the different ways that the different, among vendor and in-house that you hope to try and influence these tools that wind up being used.
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of threads there. One is that we do often work directly with vendors, and they are interested in uh, getting to use their tools in a system and learning about what the success or failure is with that. And we are interested in making sure that we're creating and installing the best products possible. Um, in order to do that, we have and are continuing to work on what are the criteria for evaluation that we need to be able to see not only from ourselves, but from a vendor coming in. So, you we have data science, really excellent data scientists working in our health system, but if they don't have access to the data that will allow them to create, an automatic monitoring system going forward, then we don't have that ability to keep a watch on the system. And so there's a lot of back and forth, but there's also a lot of what are our standards? What would we not accept in terms of being able to do data analysis, being able to do simulation? You I think mentioned simulation earlier. It's hard to do simulation if your system doesn't have a good test environment that
Mm.
a person can use in a repeated manner to try things out with. And so that's something that we try to push on. And I'd say the mentality of understanding, I think Penn does this well. I think some other systems do this well, but understanding that we are not just buying the tool, right? We are integrating a tool. Technically, we are integrating a tool in the workflows of our users, and we are ultimately creating a system of all of our different health IT tools for use by our experts,
Hmm.
by our subject matter experts. And so having that mentality, we've come really far from the off the shelf tools and are realizing that they all have to work together, not just technically, but also from a human perspective.
Yeah, and that's where we get into issues around customization, and this comes up a lot. It comes up in the Epic world. There's this concept of foundation
Hmm.
and refuel and things like that. So it's just really interesting. There's some, all these tension points that come up. We talked about friction, a little friction, not too much friction, and it also comes up around customization. And I believe they play around with the terms optimization versus customization.
Hmm.
And from an IT point of view, there's certain um, customization that we don't like because then we get off of foundation, we get off of model, we have trouble then integrating down the road. If we're running a multi-hospital health system with many different uh, people involved, we need consistency. Sometimes customization takes you away from consistency. There's a tension there. There's things you
Yeah.
can do that are
Yeah.
just fine, and there's things that you can do that are problematic from an IT point of view. What are your thoughts around that?
I think of that from a standpoint of um, a health system creating and practicing best practices.
Hmm.
So we have 7 different hospitals. Um, we are bringing everybody onto the same instance of our electronic health record vendor. Um, and that's hard, right? We have acquired hospitals that have their own instance or have their own electronic health record. And it's a difficult, painful process
Yeah.
to do that. But I'll tell you what, it's one of the best things that you can do in a health system because it makes you look at all of your practices, right? We don't just say, well, here's the system and we're just going to install it in your place now. What we say is, let's look at how yours works. Let's look at how the core system that Penn uses works. Let's do evaluations like, we're going through and evaluating our order sets. We have tons and tons of order sets that are duplicative. And so we have a small group that's working on evaluating those order sets. What is the default or recommended workflow for doing documentation? What are the pathways? We have an excellent pathway program. What are the pathways for a particular condition that if I'm operating at any of the hospital systems, I can go into the system and use the pathway to guide me through my decision-making process. That elevates all of us, right? Because we're stopping, we're evaluating, we're engaging subject matter experts, and we're creating best practices.
Right.
And I always say to people, if it's done here this way and it's working, and it's done here this way and it's maybe not working as well, why don't we figure out what's working about each way of doing it? And why don't we create a standard, a practice that works that works best for everybody? There is always going to be variation, and I think one of the other challenges is you need to identify necessary variations. Maybe your patient population is different, maybe your staffing is different. But if you don't stop and say what should be the same and what should be supported variation, then you have two systems that are working suboptimally.
Right. And it's that balance, right? It's
It's the
that balance.
balance and it's the hard work.
Yeah.
And it's HCI work, it's clinical informatics work. I think it's a bright day for clinical informatics and for HCI and human factors, because some of the new technology that's coming out is really highlighting the importance of doing this human work, this conceptual work, this best practices work, to make sure that we're not just doing whatever one particular system tells us that we should do.
Right. So I would imagine that governance is an absolute key in getting, first, you have to include a perspective such as you're bringing to the table.
Mhm.
If we think that this is important to the future of optimally delivered healthcare and the integration of technology in healthcare, and there's other health systems that listen to this and they say, you know what, we need a voice like Dr. Regli at the table in our health system. We need this point of view represented. So let's say we were able to find a Dr. Regli and bring her in. Then we would need to make sure Dr. Regli was included in the proper governance bodies so that her perspective was included in the conversations where it would be beneficial. Does that make sense? And what might some of those
Absolutely.
governance bodies look like? Who else would be on them?
Absolutely. So I will say the example from our system. I am part of the Integrated Clinical Decision Support governance body. And that is where anything that's being proposed that would be clinical decision support, different order sets, different pathways, different smart phrases, or automatic documentation tools, comes through and gets evaluated. And we look at things like usability, we look at things like effectiveness, we look at things like is it going to be standard across the health system? If not, why? And so that's a place where a voice like mine, I think, is important. And the other thing I'll say from that, this is a little off your question, but we don't just say, okay, it's approved and now we're done with it. We often say it's approved. What data are we going to look at in 6 months
Hmm.
to make sure that what we think is going to happen is actually going to happen? So you've convinced us that you do need an interruptive alert. Are people responding to it? Is it making any difference, or is it just creating more noise? And we look at that and we have, data to evaluate that. The other place is um, we do have an AI governance group, and I also lead an AI evaluation group. And so AI governance is looking at really any any proposed project coming in across the entire system, including the university, if it is a project that's going to be used clinically, then it comes to the evaluation group. And we take it through that process that I was talking to you about. So I'd say those are the two key places. Um, and then, I do, I'm often brought in on projects where there is a particularly complicated workflow. I call them wicked workflows, uh, or where it's something where we're trying to mesh together multiple workflows that are very different from one another. And there's politics around it. I've done it this way my whole life. I think it works for me. So you have to be a little bit of a negotiator as well. Um, I've been called Switzerland at at Penn, coming in to say, I don't care who does it what way. Let's look at how it should be done. Let's look at it from a standpoint of the tasks and the goals and how we achieve them. And then we can be, much more agnostic about how we're supporting those goals and those tasks.
Yeah, and I don't think we should minimize that part of your work. I think that's probably extremely important part of being effective in your role. It's
Mhm.
understanding that when we're fundamentally talking about human beings um, engaging in change or
Mhm.
embracing change, that is an extremely difficult place to navigate, especially when the kind of influential, successful people that we're dealing with and asking to change. Um, you have to be like Switzerland. You have to be very um, understanding, very patient.
Mhm.
Um, so tell us a little bit more about what I think that's the hardest part. The people that listen to this show, they know how to implement IT tools, right? They
Mhm.
know how to do implementations. It's those kind of negotiations and discussions. And generally, we're told it's all about relationships. You have to meet them before there's a crisis, before there's something you need. You have to develop the relationship, sit down, find out what they need from you. So, just a lot of human to human stuff. I would imagine it's a big part of you being successful.
It is a big part, the human to human. I would say I try to drive that interaction, not to sound like a cold fish, but I try to drive that interaction from the data,
Yeah.
right? So if we're going to talk about if, I have two people who want to talk about the way that they do something. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go talk to them about their current workflow. I'm going to go watch their people doing their current workflow. I'm going to create a diagram that shows what they're doing. And I'm going to do the same thing for the other person. And then we can both look at those external representations and try to understand, maybe we're doing the same thing, but we call it something different. Maybe we do have a variation, but it's because we have different type of staff. And then we can talk about it from the standpoint of what needs to be achieved and how is it best to, how might it best be achieved rather than, well, this is the way that I do it. Um, and when I talk about it, you're not going to understand it because you do it slightly differently. So it's really looking at data. It's looking at it's getting the information out of people's heads,
Right.
putting it onto paper, and then having that as a facilitation tool to guide the conversation. Doesn't mean it always works, but
Right.
um, getting to the data, getting to the actually what happens, what needs to happen.
And could it even be something like someone's sort of fighting for their workflow, and you're trying to persuade them that the other workflow has been established as something you want to move to, and you say, "Listen, your workflow takes 25 steps and 30 minutes. The one we're trying to move you to takes 15 steps and 15 minutes." So, right? Do you get
Yeah,
to that
yeah.
point of data where
It's
you?
that's part of it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's part of it. You can do it with time saved. You can do it with resources saved. I will say that people generally are not tied to something just because they want to be tied to it.
Hmm.
So a lot of the question asking is more about, okay, why are you doing this? Right? If this works for you, why does it I work for you. I talk about, when I'm doing an observation in a hospital, I'm actually looking for workarounds that people are doing. because not to penalize, but because if they're doing a workaround, that means that there's something they're trying to achieve
Right.
that isn't being supported by the current system or the current
Right.
workflow, right? And so it's the digging into the why that really gets you closer to the how. How can we do this in a similar way to achieve the same thing?
And that observation, I think that's critical. People shouldn't think that you're just sitting in your office all day.
Oh
Sounds like
no.
you do a lot of going to Gemba, as they say, and watching the
Yeah,
work. And I would imagine sometimes when somebody is doing something, you're in a position to be able to say, "Oh, I see, you clicked 7 times, or this took you this long. Did you know there's an easier way?"
absolutely. And we actually have a team of people here who do excuse me, the EHR transformation, and they actually do a lot of shoulder to shoulder with providers, primarily providers, some nursing, but to specifically look at the way that their system is set up and make sure that their system is optimized for the work that they do. So the preference setting, lists that you can do, automatic documentation tools. So that's very important because people don't know what they don't know, and you
Right.
can go through training when you don't. When you're not really using it, when you're just in a training class, you're not really going to know what questions you want to ask.
Right.
Right. So that shoulder to shoulder, that following a nurse around doing medication rounds is fascinating. You
Yeah.
know, on paper you might say, well, she goes to the medication room and she puts in the codes and she gets the medications out and then she goes and gives the medication. Well, guess what? She does that. She goes into the medication room. She comes out. Somebody asks her a question in the hallway. She goes into the room, say it's a diabetes medication. Well, the patient hasn't gotten their food yet, so she can't do the medication there. So now she's going back, and these are the kinds of things that when you see work as done versus work as imagined, really make a difference in the way that you build systems.
Yeah, that's brilliantly said. I like that. Work as done versus work as imagined. And that comes up a lot in business continuity, disaster recovery, scenario
Mhm.
planning, and all that kind of thing. You go through these exercises, and what you imagined would happen in a scenario like that, if you really get down to a gritty simulation, you see, oh, wait a minute, that wouldn't work, right? For
Yep.
all of these reasons that you find
Yep.
out. I want to briefly cover the idea of, and I don't know if this is an issue that comes up a lot, but the idea of upgrades of existing systems. So let's say a vendor provided system. Do you have to is it an issue where an upgrade will change around the layout of something that maybe the users have not been forewarned about? Maybe the health system wasn't even told about. I would imagine there's minor upgrades where there's really nothing material that's going to impact use, so no big deal, no harm, no foul. But
Right. Right.
maybe there is something, and maybe the proper warning wasn't given and training wasn't put out, and now it comes out, and a button that was over here is now on the other side, and the users are very upset. Does that happen?
Yes. The short answer is yes. Um, I think that we've gotten better at veering away from having that happen. I think that there's a lot of people that have to be involved in that. So we have people in our information systems organization that are looking at all of the upgrade notes that are coming out and evaluating the impact of them.
Yeah,
We have regular communications coming out about things that we think are going to have an impact on the users. We look for, if it's going to be, especially with a model change, for example, in the new tools, we try very hard to say we need to know when this is happening because we've done a lot of evaluation with the current model and things are likely to change with with a big change in a model. So, we might do some evaluation offline to see what differences are being uh, noticed in the new model. Um, it is a little bit of an art and a science. Right? But the more that you're doing regular evaluation of your tools, and the more that you're talking to your users and you know gathering feedback, the more you're going to raise the likelihood that you're going to catch things that are big issues. It's the trying to just stay in front of that curve is the most important thing. And there is a very large, set of people that are all in some way engaged in that.
All right, very good.
Or you just have somebody call the
Oh,
CHIO and say, "Why'd you move this?"
why'd you move? I'll tell you a little quick story. This is why I always think of that. My father, who's no longer with us, it's got to be 10 years ago. Um, I was at his office and he was using the Yahoo Mail, and they must have done changed it where the button was on the. He was flipping out. Why do they have to ruin everything? Why do they have to? And I'm like, Dad, it's just over there. So, you know, what can you do? People
I'll
don't
tell you
like
what,
change, especially change they didn't expect.
I'll tell you one thing. Once you get into the field that I'm in,
Yeah.
you can't go into a hotel shower or
Oh, yeah.
bathroom without doing a complete analysis, and it can drive you crazy. It's an occupational hazard
That's
because
so funny.
you sit there thinking, why? Why did
Why?
they put this in a way that I can't turn it on without hitting my head with the
Yeah.
with the
Right.
cold water, right?
Or when you want to, we all have a million devices. So in a hotel, the end table near the bed, you need outlets, right? And it's like, why are there no outlets here? Like I've got a CPAP machine, I got to charge my watch, my phone, and I'm under the bed, pushing the bed, trying to get to the one outlet. I have to unplug the lamp. It's like
Yep, yep,
nobody
yep,
does nobody
exactly.
from this
And you know what?
century stay here?
If they had two people that they watched
Yes.
coming in and setting themselves up in the hotel room, they would
Yes.
have found, 8 out of 10 of those issues. And that's why, when you argue for resources to do the kind of work that I do, it's hard to say what's the ROI other than how much we can find
Right. Right.
by doing, some fairly easy basic testing and evaluation, and design, iterative design processes versus, I used to say you can pay me now, or you can pay me a lot more later to fix it
Yep.
when you release it and nobody wants to buy it or nobody wants to use the product.
That's right.
So yeah,
All right, final question. I'm going to let you go. We're just
sure.
about out of time. There's a lot of health systems that are not going to have a human factors specialist to help them. And so what's your best advice to a CIO, a CMIO at a smaller organization where they want to take the things into account that we've discussed here, but they
Yep.
just don't have someone with a dedicated background or a dedicated role? What's your best advice to them?
Well, so first I will say that I think, one of the reasons I was happy to talk to you is that I do think that health systems, especially larger ones, do need to be paying attention to getting people with this expertise to be in-house. We are practically working as software development companies. And this is something that I think, I feel like we've put a fork in the ground here or a
Yeah,
stake in the ground. And I think that it is something that should be more broadly adopted. For the smaller systems, though, I mean, I think at Penn, we kind of feel responsibility to put out the work that we're doing, to publish, to get out evaluation frameworks that somebody could implement without too much effort, at least not the development effort of it. And so paying attention to, what's coming out on those fronts, I think is very important. There are also organizations doing work. The CHI organization is
yep,
doing work with AI safety and evaluation. And, of course, because it's the last question, I'm blanking on the others,
that's okay.
but
Chai's good. Yeah,
paying attention to what's being put out as workable frameworks and workable processes. And I think the responsibility of those who are creating them is to get them out and make them be something that can be, implemented and not just theoretical.
All right. Listen, Dr. Regli, you've been very generous with your time today. This was wonderful. I appreciate it, and I hope we can have you on again down the road. So thank you
Wonderful.
so much.
I would love to. Thanks very much for having me.
Have a great day.
You too.